They didn't have a word for it, but they knew. Children born slower, gentler, with round faces and wide-set eyes were noticed, not named. In a world ruled by survival and superstition, these souls lived somewhere between angel and anomaly, both cared for and feared, sometimes loved, sometimes left behind. This is how people with Down syndrome were seen in an age that didn't yet know what to call them. In the medieval world, medicine was crude, science was embryonic, and disability had no clinical vocabulary. But that doesn't mean people with Down syndrome went unnoticed. Their presence stirred something ancient in those around them, an uneasy mix of fascination, fear, and tenderness. Though no one could name the condition, they recognized the pattern, the slower steps, the softer speech, the gentle demeanor wrapped in bodies that defied easy explanation. Medieval records never mentioned Down syndrome. The term wouldn't exist for another 700 years. But chroniclers, monks, and even physicians wrote about people described as simple, innocent, or touched by God. These terms were vague, but often pointed to traits we now associate with intellectual disability: delayed speech, childlike behavior into adulthood, and physical features that deviated from the norm. Sometimes they were described with warmth, sometimes with pity, but rarely with cruelty in these early accounts. They were seen, even if not understood. These individuals appeared in art as well. In a handful of illuminated manuscripts and religious paintings, children with rounded faces and almond-shaped eyes are depicted quietly among other figures, never center stage but always present. Art historians have long debated whether these were idealized children or faithful renditions of real individuals. What matters is that they were included, however subtly, in the visual language of medieval life. Their presence, however faint, was recorded in brushstrokes even when absent from scrolls. And in folk tales, those windows into the fears and hopes of a time, there are stories of slow children blessed with strange insight, of mute boys who could speak to angels, of daughters born with small hands and large eyes, who were thought to be changelings sent by fairies. These weren't clinical descriptions, but they reflect a population that was noticed, interpreted, and mythologized. Even when misunderstood, they were never fully erased. The label simple was used across Europe, and while it sometimes carried derogatory connotations, it also conferred a certain status. Simple folk were often exempt from punishment, excused from obligations, and in rare cases, protected by law or custom. This wasn't kindness in the modern sense, it was more like uneasy reverence. They were considered outside the normal moral framework, neither wicked nor wise, neither fully child nor fully adult. And yet, invisibility came in a different form. Most of these individuals weren't recorded by name. They appear in the margins of parish records, in anecdotal medical texts, or tucked away in monastic notes about unusual behavior. The silence around them wasn't always neglect. It was sometimes routine. Families accepted these children into their homes without question, and the absence of drama meant their lives left little trace behind. In many cases, their existence was folded into the rhythm of daily village life, unremarkable, uncelebrated, but present. But medieval people were observant. They didn't have our words, but they had eyes, hands, and habits. They knew which children walked late, spoke little, and smiled often. They saw how some remained gentle, while others aged into struggle. And even without knowing why, they noticed. A neighbor might whisper about the soft one in the cottage, or a priest might mention the child who never lied, never fought, and never quite grew up. These weren't diagnoses, but they were recognitions. In rare cases, these individuals became known within their communities as village innocents, people seen as pure, unthreatening, and somehow closer to the divine. They might be allowed to wander freely, to sit near the altar, or to ring the bell at evening prayers. This treatment wasn't universal, but it shows that even in a harsh world, difference could sometimes be met with a kind of quiet, habitual grace. In small ways, they were included, not with understanding, but with endurance. Because medieval society may have lacked science, but it never lacked stories. And in those stories, people with Down syndrome weren't always excluded. They were woven in, awkwardly, unevenly, sometimes painfully, but woven in nonetheless. Not named, not understood, but not invisible. In the medieval world, religion wasn't just belief, it was infrastructure. It shaped law, medicine, morality, and even how people explained birth, death, and everything in between. So when a child was born with a disability, especially one as visible as Down syndrome, faith rushed in to fill the gaps science couldn't reach. And that faith cut in two directions, one towards sainthood, the other towards sin. Some saw these children as holy, pure souls sent by God, untouched by pride or temptation, living reminders of divine mystery. Their innocence was interpreted as spiritual perfection, not limitation. Monks wrote about the blessed simple, children who seemed free of earthly corruption and thus closer to heaven than anyone else in the village. In sermons and scripture, they were likened to lambs, vulnerable, gentle, and spiritually spotless. For some, caring for them became a religious duty, not out of pity, but as a sacred responsibility. Certain monastic communities even took in individuals with disabilities, housing them within abbeys as God's innocents. These were not always acts of compassion. Sometimes it was a way of removing those who didn't fit into the harsh rhythm of peasant life. But in these sanctuaries, a few found structure, food, and a strange kind of protection. They weren't monks, they weren't novices, but they were present, sweeping cloisters, ringing bells, and sitting quietly during prayer. Their silence was seen not as absence, but as devotion. Yet not all interpretations were kind. Just as often, disability was seen as a divine punishment, a visible stain revealing hidden sin. Some believed that a child born wrong was a mark of the parent's moral failure, their secret sins brought to light through the suffering of the innocent. Others traced it back even further, ancestral wrongdoing, unconfessed crimes, or curses that stretched through generations. These beliefs weighed heavy on mothers, who were blamed for everything from diet during pregnancy to spiritual negligence. Priests and preachers reinforced this fear. Some taught that such births were warnings, signs that a community had strayed from righteousness. A child with a deformity became not just a burden, but a living indictment. In regions plagued by famine or plague, families with disabled children were sometimes suspected of inviting divine wrath. Whispers spread, stares lingered, doors stayed shut. Still, there were contradictions. The same village that shunned a touched child might also claim they had visions, or could sense danger, or brought good fortune simply by being near. Miracles were in short supply, and people clung to any sign of the supernatural, no matter how paradoxical. A boy who could not speak might be said to hear angels. A girl who laughed at funerals might be seen as possessing hidden wisdom. Faith made room for contradiction, and in that space, people with Down syndrome sometimes lived between rejection and reverence. Religious festivals offered rare moments of inclusion. During processions and feast days, those seen as blessed simple were sometimes given roles, carrying candles, holding banners, or walking alongside the clergy. The community watched them with curiosity and caution, unsure whether they were being honored or appeased. But in those fleeting moments, they stood not at the margins, but at the center. The church itself never offered a unified doctrine on intellectual disability. Some bishops condemned superstition and urged compassion. Others spoke of cleansing, penance, and spiritual healing through prayer, fasting, or even exorcism. The treatment a person received depended largely on geography, local clergy, and the social standing of their family. In some towns, a child was hidden. In others, they were embraced. And in many, they were simply endured. Because in a world ruled by scripture and fear, people with Down syndrome were mirrors. To some, they reflected innocence. To others, guilt. And to most, they represented something too complex to define, too sacred, or too terrifying to ignore. Medieval life was built on rhythm, sunrise to sunset, sowing to harvest, cradle to grave. For most, survival came from land, livestock, and labor. And into this tight cycle of necessity, A child born with Down syndrome arrived not with explanation, but with implication. What did it mean for a family barely surviving to raise someone who might never plow, count, or marry? The first truth is simple. Most of these children stayed home. Institutionalization was rare outside of cities and monastic orders. In rural communities, families cared for their own, not always well, not always kindly, but consistently. A child who was different wasn't necessarily cast out. More often, they were woven into the life of the household in ways that reflected both affection and pragmatism. If they could carry firewood, feed chickens, or watch younger siblings, they were useful. If they could not, they were still there, fed, clothed, and sheltered as long as the family endured. Much depended on the parents. Some saw these children as blessings. Others saw them as burdens. A deeply religious mother might protect her angel child with fierce devotion, seeing them as God's test or gift. A struggling father might withdraw, ashamed that his son could not help in the fields or bring in a dowry. In large families, the emotional and physical labor often shifted to siblings, especially older sisters, who became caretakers out of duty, love, or expectation. These dynamics were rarely spoken aloud, but they shaped everything. Communal life reinforced these roles. Villages operated on mutual observation. Everyone saw everything. A child who wandered strangely or spoke with difficulty drew attention, but not always ridicule. In smaller communities, difference became familiarity. That boy who couldn't follow a plow might still be the one who remembered which goat belonged to which household. That girl who rarely spoke might sing to herself while gathering kindling, her voice a constant in the morning air. Presence became participation, even when ability didn't match expectation. Still, acceptance had limits. During times of stress, bad harvests, illness, war, tolerance thinned. Mouths to feed were counted carefully. A child who couldn't contribute became a calculation, and the results weren't always kind. Some were left behind during relocations. Some died of neglect rather than violence, and some were quietly given less. Fewer blankets in winter, fewer scraps at mealtime, less patience when they cried. Survival hardened the heart even toward its own. But exclusion wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it came dressed as protection. Families might keep their simple child indoors, away from mocking children or wandering soldiers. Girls with disabilities were especially vulnerable to abuse, and many parents chose isolation over risk. What looked like secrecy was often fear, and what looked like shame was sometimes love with no safe outlet. Weddings rarely came. In a world where marriage was economic before emotional, people with intellectual disabilities were almost never considered viable spouses. But celibacy didn't mean loneliness. Some formed deep bonds within their families or with animals they cared for. Others became fixtures in village life, known by name, greeted with nods, folded into festivals with small symbolic tasks. Carrying flowers, holding candles, dancing even if out of rhythm. They belonged, if not entirely, then enough. And while most lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, their presence left quiet imprints. On the younger sibling they protected, on the neighbor they followed, on the priest who learned to speak slower just for them. Their lives didn't make it into chronicles or court records, but they shaped memory, carved into the rhythms of households, markets, and harvests. Because in the medieval village, survival wasn't just about work, it was about endurance, familiarity, and the slow weaving of lives together over decades. And in that tapestry, even the threads that didn't match the pattern had a place, imperfect, fragile, but never entirely pulled loose. In medieval Europe, illness wasn't just a matter of the body, it was a matter of the soul. And for conditions that didn't fit visible wounds or obvious fevers, people looked beyond blood and bone for answers. A child with Down syndrome, born without injury but still not right, often became the focus of both desperate remedies and dangerous rituals. The line between medicine and superstition wasn't just thin, it was constantly shifting. Physicians of the time, when consulted at all, offered little help. Their understanding of the mind was rooted in the theory of humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. An imbalance, they said, caused melancholy, mania, or confusion. A child who didn't speak or who laughed at nothing might be said to suffer from an excess of phlegm. Too cold, too moist, too passive. The cure? A mix of warm herbs, purges or bloodletting. Treatments that didn't heal but did exhaust. More commonly, families turned to folk healers, midwives, herbalists, or wandering wise women who blended medicine with magic. They might brew teas of sage and lavender to clear the fog, or place charms around a child's neck to drive out ill spirits. Some advised bathing the child in moonlit streams or smudging the doorways with smoke to purify the home. None of these were cruel in intent, but none of them helped in practice. They were rituals of hope, acts performed to soothe the parent more than the child. And then came the darker practices. In households where patience ran thin or fear ran high, children were subjected to harsher treatments. Some were held over smoke to choke out the demon. Others were whipped lightly with birch twigs in an effort to wake up the mind. In rare and tragic cases, families brought their children to local priests for exorcism, not because they believed the child was evil, but because they had no other language for difference. Exorcisms varied. Some were quiet prayers whispered over cradles. Others were violent, filled with shouting, holy water, and trembling hands. A child who resisted or cried was seen as proof that the devil resisted expulsion. There are scattered accounts, hard to verify but deeply haunting, of children with disabilities who were starved, beaten, or isolated in attempts to free them from the grip of unseen forces. These were not the norm, but neither were they unheard of. Astrology, too, had its place. Midwives and clerics might study the stars to determine whether a child's condition was fated. Born under the wrong planet, they said. Saturn was often blamed. Cold, heavy, slow, traits mirrored in the simple-minded. Some parents took comfort in this, believing it was fate, not failure. Others lived in fear, watching the sky for signs of further misfortune. Horoscopes were written with solemn gravity, and every misstep became a matter of cosmic consequence. Animals were sometimes used in rituals. A goose feather passed over the child's body, a lamb's breath blown across their face, or a cat's paw tied to the wrist, all desperate attempts to balance the unseen forces thought to be at play. These acts seem strange to us, but in a world with no diagnosis and no cure, they offered structure in the face of helplessness. Superstition filled the silence left by ignorance, and still, in the margins, there were the quiet acts of care. Mothers who refused to let their children be touched by wandering healers. Fathers who carried them home after failed rituals, eyes cast down, faith fraying. Not every family bought into quackery. Not every village gave in to fear. Some simply accepted what they didn't understand and chose to love anyway. The problem wasn't malice, it was ignorance. In a world where childbirth could kill, where infection meant death, where prayers were often the only medicine available, difference was terrifying. People didn't know what Down syndrome was. They only knew their child was vulnerable, unpredictable, and unlike the others. And in that vacuum of knowledge, myths grew like weeds.
So they tried everything. Every leaf, every prayer, every drop of blood. They weren't trying to punish, they were trying to fix. Because they believed something was broken, and no one had yet told them that sometimes nothing needed fixing at all. In a world without diagnosis or dignity for the different, some people with visible disabilities found themselves not in homes or fields, but in courts. Behind stone walls and velvet curtains, medieval nobility sometimes kept individuals with intellectual disabilities as court fools, believing their behavior to be entertaining, prophetic, or simply amusing. These were not actors. These were real people, taken from villages, dressed in bright colors and placed on display. The role of the fool was more than comic relief. In many courts, the fool was expected to speak truths others could not, shielded by his status as mad or simple. But that freedom came at a price, the loss of autonomy, identity, and safety. Nobles laughed when the fool stumbled or stammered. They cheered when he mimicked guests or danced out of rhythm. And behind every performance was a human being who had been turned into a symbol of disorder, of divine irony, or of cruel amusement.
Historical records offer glimpses into these lives. Some were referred to as natural fools, a term used to distinguish those with intellectual disabilities from performers who merely played the part. These individuals were often described as childlike, harmless, or blessed with foolish joy. Some were given food, warm shelter, even jewelry. But comfort did not equal consent. They were not guests. They were property. Portraits from the 14th and 15th centuries depict fools with physical traits now recognized as consistent with Down syndrome: rounded faces, slanted eyes, short stature. One example is the court of the Duke of Burgundy, where a man known only as Jacques the Innocent was documented as both entertainer and companion. He was fed better than peasants, clothed in fine fabrics, and walked alongside nobles during ceremonies. Yet he remained nameless in official histories, his existence noted only in expense ledgers and marginalia. Some families viewed placement at court as a strange form of fortune. A child who couldn't farm or marry might be sent to serve nobility, where food was plentiful and weather less cruel. But they didn't go there by choice. They were taken, offered, or sold. What looked like luxury was often gilded captivity, life in a palace, but always under watch, always the object of amusement or pity. The spectacle extended beyond castles. Traveling shows, fairs, and markets sometimes displayed people with physical or cognitive differences as curiosities. Though rare in rural areas, in cities these exhibitions drew crowds hungry for distraction. A boy who spoke oddly, a girl who laughed at nothing. They were presented as wonders, monsters, or divine mistakes, paid in scraps, surrounded by stares, and remembered only as passing oddities. Not all experiences were violent or degrading. There are records of fools who were genuinely loved, protected, and included in courtly life. But these cases were the exception, not the rule. More often, they were tolerated so long as they entertained. Once they aged or grew sick or became less amusing, they were quietly removed, sent back to villages, monasteries, or into the streets. Humor can hide cruelty, and in the medieval court, laughter often masked discomfort, superiority, or fear. Nobles feared madness, feared disorder, feared anything that reminded them of life beyond control. The fool became a mirror, showing them what they dared not admit, that status could not prevent chaos, and that even kings laughed nervously when difference stood too close. For people with Down syndrome, to become a fool was sometimes the only path to visibility. But it was a visibility defined by distortion. They were not known for who they were, but for how they looked, moved, or failed to conform. Their joy was repackaged as humor. Their confusion became comedy, and their silence was filled in by the stories others told about them. Because when society doesn't understand difference, it often turns it into a show. And behind every performance, beneath every hat with bells and every forced smile, was someone who might have lived quietly in a village, had fate been kinder. Most medieval people with Down syndrome left no name, no tombstone, no trace. Their lives passed like candlelight, flickering briefly inside homes, courts, and cloisters before vanishing into the dark. Not because they were unimportant, but because history didn't record people who didn't speak loudly, fight battles, or hold power. And for those born with intellectual disabilities, silence wasn't just the end of their story, it was its only witness. The historical record is built on parchment and privilege. It remembers kings and crimes, plagues and pacts. It forgets the ordinary. It especially forgets those who couldn't write, speak, or act in ways considered worthy of remembrance. People with Down syndrome fell outside the narrative frame, not because they weren't present, but because chroniclers didn't know what to make of them. Their existence was acknowledged in metaphor, in myth, or not at all. Every so often we glimpse them. A line in a church ledger, the simple boy at the altar, a note in a monk's diary, the child who smiled at the saints, a scribbled expense, wool tunic for the fool. These fragments are precious, not because they're detailed, but because they're rare. They confirm what logic already told us, that people with Down syndrome lived, worked, laughed, and were seen. Just not in ways that history thought to preserve. Part of the loss lies in language. Before the 19th century, there was no formal vocabulary to describe intellectual disability in medical terms, so people used euphemism: innocent, slow, blessed, or worse. Monster, error, cursed. These words were imprecise, shifting, often layered with religious or superstitious meaning. And because the same terms were used for everything from trauma to epilepsy to dementia, many records become a fog. We read them today not with clarity, but with educated guesswork. Another reason is shame. In many communities, difference was hidden, out of fear, stigma, or misunderstanding. Families didn't announce when a child was born with unusual traits. They sheltered them, sometimes loved them, sometimes didn't, but rarely documented them. There was no incentive to write about someone who couldn't inherit land, join the church, or lead a household. And so, lives were lived without language and were buried without inscription. Even art speaks in silences. Most medieval paintings idealized the human form. Difference was rarely captured faithfully. Faces were smoothed, expressions neutralized, bodies corrected by the brush. Only in the margins, illuminated by quiet hands, do we see something closer to truth. A child with wide-set eyes gazing past the Virgin, or a figure crouched in the corner of a feast, smiling at nothing. These moments are not proof, but they are possibility. And yet the absence of records is itself a form of testimony. It reveals what societies valued and what they didn't. The fact that so many lived and died without documentation is not a reflection on them, but on the structures that excluded them. Their forgottenness is not failure. It is indictment. But even in silence, impact lingers. A mother remembered her son long after the priest forgot him. A sibling recalled the songs they shared, long after neighbors turned away. Memory doesn't only live in ink. It lives in rhythm, in ritual, in the way certain names are never spoken, but never truly lost. These were not nameless people. They were people with names that history chose not to carry forward. And in that silence lies the most powerful truth, that people with Down syndrome have always been here, in cathedrals and cottages, on battlefields and back roads. Their absence from the record isn't proof they were excluded from life, only from the telling of it. They were not invisible. They were made invisible. Which is why remembering them now matters. Not to romanticize, not to pity, but to acknowledge, to say, you were here. You were always here. And your story deserves more than a footnote in someone else's chronicle. They had no diagnosis, no title, no written legacy, but they were here. In silent corners of cottages, in the margins of manuscripts, in the soft spaces that history forgot to document. They were sung to, cared for, mocked, hidden, and sometimes loved. Not as saints or symbols, but as sons, daughters, neighbors, and souls trying to survive a world that didn't yet know what to call them. So next time you think of the Middle Ages, don't just picture kings and crusades. Remember the child with the crooked smile and gentle hands, the one no one wrote about, because no one thought to ask who they truly were.